Chloe. Ah, no, we can't. This is wrong. The words were a whisper, a ghost of protest lost in a ragged gasp of air. Silk rustled against bare skin, a sound that was swallowed by the frantic beating of two hearts. A hand, her hand, clutched at the cool cotton of the bedsheets, fingers knotting and unknotting, twisting the fabric as a wave of forbidden pleasure crested, washing away every last thought of right and wrong, of before and after. For a moment that stretched into eternity, there was only this shattering, all-consuming release. But that climax, that moment of illicit surrender, had its beginning just hours earlier, in the sterile silence of a perfect morning. The sun cast long, clean lines across the marble floors of the Connecticut home Amelia had spent a decade curating. It was a house that graced the pages of magazines, a testament to good taste, and a life of effortless wealth. But today, on the morning of her 10th wedding anniversary, the silence within its walls was heavier than usual, the sunlight colder. Richard was already gone, of course. His presence was marked only by the faint scent of his cologne hanging in the air and a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen island, propped against a small, elegantly wrapped box. Happy anniversary, my love. See you tonight, R. Amelia ran her fingers over the smooth paper of the gift, a familiar sense of resignation settling over her. She knew what would be inside. A bracelet, perhaps. A necklace. Something tasteful, expensive, and impersonal, chosen by an assistant and approved via email. She untied the ribbon with practiced ease, her movements graceful and tired. But when she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't jewelry. Lying on a bed of black tissue paper was a set of lingerie. It was made of the most delicate black lace and silk, so exquisitely crafted it looked like a web of shadows. It was impossibly beautiful, dangerously sensual, and utterly unlike anything Richard would ever choose for her. And then she saw it. Tucked into the lace of the bra was a small, cream-colored card. The handwriting was not Richard's rushed scrawl, but a graceful, deliberate script penned in dark ink. It read, "He thought you'd look beautiful in this. Happy anniversary." Amelia stood motionless, the cold of the marble floor seeping into her bare feet. This wasn't a gift from her husband. It was a message, sent from his world, from a woman she had never met. It was an act of intimacy so profound, so audacious, that it felt like a violation. It wasn't a gift, it was a challenge. There were no tears, no shattered porcelain, no frantic calls to a friend. The woman who discovered the gift was not the woman who existed an hour earlier. That woman was soft, accommodating, a creature of quiet routines and unspoken disappointments. The woman who stood now, in the cold morning light, was something else entirely. She was a statue of ice and resolve, the black lace lingerie held loosely in her hand, feeling as heavy as a weapon. She methodically placed the lingerie back into its box, retying the ribbon with a precision that felt foreign to her own fingers. She walked upstairs, her steps silent on the thick carpet, and moved directly to her closet. She didn't choose a suit, which would have been too aggressive, or a simple dress, which would have been too weak. She chose a sheath dress of charcoal gray wool, a garment of severe elegance that hugged her form not with seduction, but with authority. It was her armor. Her makeup was a mask applied with the steady hand of a surgeon, a foundation to hide the paleness of her shock, a thin, sharp line of black eyeliner to give her eyes a focus they didn't feel, and a deep red lipstick that was a statement of defiance. She was not a grieving wife. She was a woman going to a meeting. The drive into the city was a blur of familiar highways and muted colors. The car, a luxury sedan Richard had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago, felt like a cage of leather and glass. She didn't turn on the radio. She let the silence press in, letting her anger cool and harden from a raging fire into a sharp, focused point. She wasn't angry at Richard, not yet. That would come later, a complex and agonizing storm. Right now, all of her energy, every fiber of her being, was directed at the woman with the graceful handwriting. The architectural firm of Thompson and Vance occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. It was Richard's kingdom, a world of steel, glass, and quiet, ruthless ambition. Amelia had only been there a handful of times for holiday parties, always feeling like a decorative accessory on her husband's arm. Today, she walked in alone. The receptionist, a young woman with impossibly perfect hair, looked up with a practiced, bright smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Is Mr. Thompson expecting you?" Amelia gave a small, cool smile in return. "No," she said, her voice even. "I'm here to see Chloe." The receptionist's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of confusion that Amelia registered with grim satisfaction. "Chloe? Do you mean Chloe Sterling?" she asked, recovering quickly. "Yes. Please let her know Amelia Thompson is here to see her." Amelia didn't wait in the designated seating area. She stood by the large window, looking down at the city below, her posture ramrod straight. A few moments later, the receptionist spoke again, her voice a little more subdued. "Miss Sterling will see you now. It's the third office on the left." The main office was an open-plan expanse of minimalist desks and focused faces. The air hummed with quiet productivity. As Amelia walked, she felt dozens of curious eyes on her, this strange, elegant woman who was not part of their world. She ignored them. Chloe's office was not a cubicle. It was a spacious room, walled in by floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the main floor like a control tower. The woman sitting behind the large, uncluttered desk looked up as Amelia approached. She was exactly as Amelia had imagined, and yet, so much more. Chloe Sterling was beautiful, but it wasn't a soft, gentle beauty. It was a sharp, polished beauty that spoke of discipline and control. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, not a single strand out of place. She wore a navy blue dress, tailored to perfection, its simple lines accentuating a body that was lean and strong. Her makeup was subtle, her nails perfectly manicured. She looked less like a secretary and more like the CEO. She stood as Amelia entered, a gesture of professional courtesy that felt like a power move. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "This is a surprise." Amelia closed the glass door behind her, the soft click shutting out the rest of the world. She walked to the desk and, without a word, placed the gift-wrapped box between them. It sat on the polished wood surface, a silent accusation. Chloe's eyes, a cool and intelligent shade of blue, flickered down to the box and then back up to Amelia's face. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her perfectly painted lips. She didn't feign ignorance. She didn't gasp or deny it. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging it. "Please, have a seat," Chloe offered, gesturing to one of the chairs in front of her desk. "No, thank you," Amelia replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "I prefer to stand." A silent battle of wills played out in the space of a few heartbeats. Chloe held Amelia's gaze, her expression unreadable. She was assessing Amelia, taking in the expensive dress, the rigid posture, the fire burning behind her cool gray eyes. Finally, Chloe gave a slight nod and sat back down, leaning back in her chair in a posture of relaxed confidence. It was a concession, but it also placed her in a position of judgment. "Why?" Amelia asked, the single word cutting through the silence. Chloe picked up a heavy silver pen from her desk, turning it over in her long, slender fingers. It was a gesture designed to stall, to project calm. "Why not?" she countered, her voice soft. "It's your anniversary. I thought it was a beautiful piece. I thought you would appreciate it." "You thought?" Amelia repeated, a note of incredulity creeping into her voice. "What business is it of yours what I would appreciate?" "Richard talks about you," Chloe said, her gaze steady. "He worries. He says you've been distant. He wanted to get you something special, something to reignite things, perhaps. He's not very good at these things. He asked for my opinion." It was a masterful lie, constructed to inflict the maximum amount of pain. It created a world where her husband and this woman shared confidences about her, a world where Chloe was the expert on Amelia's own marriage. Every word was a carefully aimed dart. "My marriage, and any reigniting it may or may not need, is not a subject for your professional consultation," Amelia said, her knuckles white where she gripped her handbag. Chloe's smile widened slightly, a flash of something that looked like pity. "Is it not? From where I sit, Mrs. Thompson, Your marriage is a significant part of my professional life. When Richard is happy, the firm thrives. When he is distracted, things suffer. I have a vested interest in his happiness. She had just called Amelia a distraction, a problem to be managed. The audacity of it was breathtaking. For a moment, Amelia pictured herself lunging across the desk, her manicured nails clawing at that perfect, serene face. But she held her ground, fueled by a cold rage that was far more potent than any physical outburst. She had come here for a confession, for a tearful admission of guilt. She had expected to find a cheap, common homewrecker. Instead, she had found a formidable opponent, a woman who was playing a game so subtle and complex that Amelia was only just beginning to understand the rules. She was out of her depth, and for the first time that day, a sliver of fear pierced her armor of anger. The confrontation was a failure. She had no move left to make. Amelia took a deep breath, preparing to turn and leave, to retreat and rethink her strategy. But then, Chloe leaned forward, her expression changing. The professional mask softened, replaced by something that looked unnervously like sincerity. "Look," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone. "This office, it isn't the place for this conversation. The air is too thin here." She stood up, her movements fluid. "Let me buy you a drink. After work. Somewhere quiet. We can talk." Woman to woman, no pretenses. The offer was so unexpected, so disarming, that it threw Amelia completely off balance. It was a ceasefire, an invitation to cross enemy lines. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the clear, clean lines of animosity. But a deeper, more dangerous curiosity stirred within her. She wanted to understand this woman. She needed to know the full extent of the world she had just discovered. It was a reckless, foolish impulse, but it was also the only path that felt real. "Fine," Amelia heard herself say, the word tasting like surrender and opportunity all at once. "Fine." The rest of the afternoon passed in a state of suspended reality. Amelia did not go home. The thought of returning to that silent, perfect house, to the box sitting on her dresser like an unexploded bomb, was unbearable. Instead, she drove aimlessly for a while before finding herself at the city's modern art museum, a place she and Richard hadn't visited together in years. She walked through the cavernous white galleries, a ghost among the living, staring at chaotic canvases of color and tortured sculptures of metal without really seeing them. She was trying to make sense of the morning, of the woman with the cool blue eyes and unnerving composure. Every rational part of her mind screamed that the invitation for a drink was a trap. It was a continuation of the game, another move on a chessboard she didn't understand. Chloe wanted something. Women like her always wanted something. To go would be to walk willingly into the lion's den, to grant her enemy the satisfaction of an audience. And yet, a deeper, more insistent voice whispered a different story. It was the voice of a profound, aching curiosity. It was the desire not just to fight this woman, but to understand her. To understand how her own life, her own marriage, could have a secret chapter written in a stranger's graceful script. By the time she left the museum at 5 o'clock, the decision had been made. She would go. The bar Chloe had chosen was called the Penumbra. It was tucked away on a quiet side street, its entrance marked only by a single, unmarked mahogany door. Inside, the world slowed down. The lighting was impossibly dim, casting everything in a warm, amber glow. The air smelled of old leather, whiskey, and a faint hint of perfume. Soft, instrumental jazz drifted from hidden speakers, and the low murmur of conversation provided a blanket of privacy. It was a place designed for secrets. Chloe was already there, settled into a dark leather booth in the furthest corner of the room. She had changed out of her severe office dress. Now she wore a simple, black silk blouse that draped elegantly over her shoulders, paired with dark trousers. Her hair was down, falling in a soft, controlled wave past her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, but no less formidable. She raised a hand in a small, graceful gesture as Amelia approached, a glass of dark liquor already in front of her. "I'm glad you came," Chloe said, her voice a low murmur that blended perfectly with the room's atmosphere. "I wasn't sure you would." Amelia slid into the booth, the leather cool against her skin. I'm not sure why I did, she answered honestly, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the clientele of well-dressed men and women speaking in hushed tones. This was Chloe's world, confident, understated, expensive. A waiter appeared instantly, as if summoned by magic. A glass of Sauvignon Blanc, Amelia ordered, choosing something familiar and safe. Chloe watched her, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. I'm having a rye old-fashioned, she said, as if sharing a small confidence. My one vice. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. The animosity from the office still lingered in the air between them, a static charge. Amelia searched for something to say, a way to begin, but her mind was blank. It was Chloe who broke the spell. She took a slow sip of her drink, the ice clinking softly against the heavy crystal. I want to be clear about something, she began, setting the glass down and looking directly at Amelia. The gift. It was a terrible, miscalculated thing to do. It was cruel. I'm not going to apologize, because a word like sorry is meaningless, but I want you to know that I am aware of its cruelty. Amelia was stunned into silence. This was not the opening she had expected. She had braced herself for more lies, more manipulation. This raw, unflinching honesty was a more effective weapon than any deception. Then why? Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Chloe sighed. A sound of genuine weariness that seemed to crack her polished veneer just a little. Because I'm a lonely, ambitious woman in a city that eats people like me for breakfast. And because your husband, Richard, is the most brilliant and the most blind man I have ever met. She leaned forward, her blue eyes intense in the dim light. I didn't do it to hurt you, not really. I did it to be seen. By him, by you, by anyone. To feel like I exist outside of my job description. She spoke about her life then, not in a way that pleaded for sympathy, but with a stark, factual clarity. She talked about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about an academic scholarship that was her only ticket out. She spoke of the relentless hard work, the sacrifices, the casual sexism she faced, the constant pressure to be smarter, sharper, and more put together than any of her male colleagues. Richard gave me a chance, she said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. He's the first man who ever looked at my work and saw its value without immediately trying to get me into bed. He respects my mind, and for that, I would do almost anything for him. As Amelia listened, a strange and unsettling thing began to happen. The image of the scheming, predatory mistress started to dissolve, replaced by the portrait of a woman who was, in her own way, just as trapped as Amelia was. Trapped by her ambition, by her gratitude, by her connection to a man who saw her as an efficient, valuable asset. The conversation inevitably drifted back to Richard, but this time it was different. Chloe spoke of him not as a lover, but as a subject of shared study. She described his habits with an anthropologist's precision, the way he would chew on the end of his pen when deep in thought, his complete inability to remember birthdays or anniversaries without 3 separate calendar alerts, the way he could spend 16 hours perfecting a single blueprint but couldn't spend 10 minutes asking about someone's day. He doesn't see people, Chloe said softly, her voice devoid of malice, filled only with a sad truth. He sees projects. He sees problems to be solved. The firm is a project. His career is a project. Even his home, his life, it's a project to be maintained at optimal efficiency. Every word resonated with a truth so deep and familiar that it made Amelia's chest ache. Chloe was giving voice to a decade of Amelia's own silent frustrations. She was describing the slow, creeping loneliness of being married to a man who was physically present but emotionally 1,000 miles away. For years, Amelia had thought this was her failure, that she wasn't interesting enough, not beautiful enough, not enough to hold his attention. But hearing it from Chloe, the woman she was supposed to hate, it was suddenly clear. It wasn't her, it was him. An unexpected wave of empathy washed over Amelia, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She looked at Chloe, really looked at her, and saw not an enemy, but a mirror. A different, sharper, more modern reflection, but a mirror nonetheless. 2 women orbiting the same cold star, starving for a little warmth. He forgot my birthday last year, Amelia heard herself say, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. He remembered 2 days later. He had his assistant, the one before you send me $1,000 worth of flowers. He thought it fixed it. Chloe nodded slowly, her eyes full of a shared understanding that was more intimate than any touch. He thinks everything can be fixed with a grand gesture, she said. He doesn't understand that all people really want is the small ones. They sat in silence for a long time after that, drinking their drinks, two enemies who had stumbled into the strange, neutral territory of a common truth. The armor had cracked, the battle lines had blurred. And in the warm, secret-keeping darkness of the penumbra, something new and dangerous was beginning to take root. The days following their meeting at the penumbra were disorienting. Amelia felt as though she were moving through a dream, her familiar life suddenly rendered strange and two-dimensional. The clean lines of her home felt like a movie set. The predictable rhythm of her suburban existence seemed hollow, a pantomime she was performing without conviction. She would find herself standing in the middle of a room, a half-dusted table, or a half-arranged bouquet of flowers in front of her, her mind replaying the conversation in the dimly lit bar. She dissected every word, every glance, every nuance of Chloe's voice. The anger she had felt, that righteous, clarifying fury, had been replaced by something far more complicated and unsettling, a fascination that bordered on obsession. Richard remained blissfully oblivious. He came home late, smelling of the city and takeout coffee, his mind still tangled in blueprints and client negotiations. He would give her a perfunctory kiss, ask a vague question about her day without waiting for the answer, and retreat into his study. His blindness, which once felt like a dull ache of neglect, now felt like a form of freedom. His physical presence in the house was a mere technicality. The man himself was absent, leaving a vacuum that Amelia was beginning to realize she desperately wanted to fill. She was untethered, and the only other person who seemed to understand the peculiar gravity of her world was the one person she was supposed to consider her enemy. The invitation came 4 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon. It arrived not as a call, but as a simple, discreet text message on her phone. Hi, Amelia. I have the preliminary renderings for the Blackwood Lake House project. Richard mentioned you have a wonderful eye for aesthetics and spatial flow. I thought you might like a private look before they're presented to the clients this Friday. Let me know if you'd like to stop by my place after work sometime this week. See, it was a perfect pretext. It was professional, plausible, and it appealed directly to a part of Amelia she thought had long since atrophied. The artist, the woman with a wonderful eye. It gave her a reason, a shield of legitimacy to hide behind. She could tell herself she was going for the architecture, to feel a flicker of her old life, to engage in something intelligent and creative. She could ignore the frantic, insistent pulse that hammered in her veins at the mere thought of seeing Chloe again. She texted back a simple, measured response. Thank you, Chloe. That's very thoughtful. Would tomorrow evening be convenient? The reply was instantaneous. Perfect. Chloe lived in a part of the city that felt like another country compared to Amelia's manicured suburban enclave. It was a neighborhood of converted warehouses and sleek modern high-rises, where art galleries nestled next to Michelin-starred restaurants. It was a world that hummed with energy, creativity, and an anonymity. Amelia found both terrifying and thrilling. The elevator in Chloe's building was silent and swift, lifting her high above the city streets. With each ascending floor, her heart beat a little faster. This was a mistake. She should turn around, go home, delete the text messages, and pretend the last week had never happened. But her feet remained planted, and when the elevator doors opened onto a quiet, minimalist hallway, she walked towards Chloe's apartment as if pulled by an invisible string. The door opened before she had a chance to knock. Chloe stood there, and the sight of her stole the air from Amelia's lungs. She was not the sharply dressed professional from the office, nor the elegantly casual woman from the bar. This was a private Chloe, a version Amelia felt no one else was privileged to see. She was barefoot, wearing a pair of soft, gray cashmere lounge pants and a simple, cream-colored silk camisole held up by spaghetti straps. Her blonde hair was loose, slightly tousled, and she wore no makeup. She looked unguarded, vulnerable, and more devastatingly beautiful than ever. Amelia, she said, her voice a soft welcome. Come in. Amelia stepped over the threshold, and the door closed softly behind her, sealing them inside. Chloe's apartment was a physical extension of her mind. ordered, intelligent, and possessing a cool, minimalist beauty. The main living space was a vast, open-plan room with polished concrete floors and one entire wall made of glass, offering a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline as dusk began to settle. The furniture was sparse but deliberate: a low-slung charcoal sofa, a glass coffee table holding a few art books, a single, powerful, abstract painting on the far wall that pulsed with color. The air was filled with a subtle, clean scent of sandalwood and white tea. It was a space that was both deeply personal and impeccably controlled, and it made Amelia feel clumsy and overdressed in her tasteful day dress and heels. "Can I get you some wine?" Chloe asked, moving towards the sleek, modern kitchen. "Yes, please," Amelia managed to say, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. She watched Chloe move, her bare feet silent on the concrete. She saw the graceful line of her back, the delicate shape of her shoulder blades beneath the thin silk of her camisole. A wave of heat washed over her, unexpected and intense. This was not about architecture. This was not about Richard. This was about the woman moving with such languid grace in front of her. Chloe returned with 2 glasses of chilled white wine, the crystal so fine it was almost invisible. As she handed a glass to Amelia, her fingers brushed against Amelia's own. The contact was fleeting, lasting no more than a second, but it sent a shockwave up Amelia's arm. It was like a spark of static electricity, a sudden sharp jolt that made her gasp. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the pretext of their meeting dissolved into thin air. They both knew why she was here. The air grew thick, with unspoken things. To break the spell, Amelia walked towards the wall of glass, wrapping her arms around herself. "The view is incredible," she said, stating the obvious. Chloe came to stand beside her, not too close, but near enough that Amelia could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. They stood in silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to twinkle to life below them, 2 solitary figures against a backdrop of a million other lives. "He doesn't know you're here, does he?" Chloe asked quietly. "No," Amelia replied, her voice just as soft. "Does it matter?" "I don't know," Chloe said, and she sounded truly uncertain. "Everything feels complicated." She turned her body slightly to face Amelia, her expression serious. "That day in my office, you looked at me with such hatred. I deserved it, but I have to ask, do you still hate me, Amelia?" Amelia looked at her, at the genuine question in those intelligent blue eyes, at the vulnerability of her bare shoulders, at the soft curve of her lips. She searched for the anger, the sharp-edged hatred that had been her shield, but it was gone. In its place was a confusing, terrifying, and exhilarating swirl of emotions she couldn't begin to name. "No," Amelia confessed, the word a quiet surrender. "I don't hate you." A slow, sad smile touched Chloe's lips. She raised her hand, as if to touch Amelia's cheek, but then let it fall back to her side. The aborted gesture was more intimate than any touch. The tension in the room was now a living thing, a palpable presence that hummed between them, drawing them closer. Amelia could feel the pull of it, a magnetic force that was both frightening and irresistible. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to leave this beautiful, sterile apartment and the intoxicating woman who lived in it. But her body was betraying her, leaning almost imperceptibly closer, craving the warmth, the scent, the connection she had been starved of for so long. She saw Chloe's gaze drop to her mouth, and her own breath hitched in her throat. This was it. The final moment. The edge of the cliff. The threshold of a door she knew, once she walked through it, she could never close again. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile truce, a quiet confession. Number Amelia had answered Chloe's question, and in doing so, had answered a dozen others she hadn't dared to ask herself. "No, I don't hate you." And in the space created by that single word, the tension that had been simmering between them finally reached its boiling point. Chloe closed the small distance that remained, her movements so fluid and certain that Amelia had no time to think, no time to retreat. One of Chloe's hands came up to cradle the side of Amelia's face, her thumb stroking her cheekbone with an impossible gentleness that shattered Amelia's last defense. And then, Chloe's lips were on hers. The kiss was not what she had imagined. It wasn't soft or tentative. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a release of all the unspoken words, the simmering anger, the forbidden curiosity, and the profound, aching loneliness that had defined both of their lives. It tasted of expensive white wine, of unspoken secrets, and of a desire so raw and overwhelming that it felt like a force of nature. For a dizzying second, Amelia's entire world narrowed to this single point of contact. The impossible softness of Chloe's mouth, the scent of her skin, the firm, confident pressure of her hand holding her steady. Then, the reality of what she was doing crashed down upon her. The image of Richard's face, of her pristine home, of her carefully constructed life, flashed behind her closed eyelids. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, surged through her. Her hands came up, pushing weakly against Chloe's shoulders. "Chloe," she breathed against her mouth, the name a broken plea. "No, we shouldn't. Please stop." Her resistance was genuine, a last frantic gasp of the woman she had been that morning, but it was utterly futile. Chloe didn't stop, but she didn't force her either. Instead, she softened the kiss, her lips moving against Amelia's with a persuasive, hypnotic rhythm. Her other hand moved from Amelia's face to the back of her neck, her fingers tangling in her hair, sending shivers down her spine. She whispered Amelia's name, a sound that was both a question and a prayer, and in that sound, Amelia heard not just passion, but understanding. Chloe was not a predator cornering her prey. She was a woman offering a sanctuary Amelia hadn't known she was seeking, and in that moment, Amelia's resistance crumbled into dust. The hands that had been pushing Chloe away now clung to her, pulling her closer. The mouth that had been whispering protests now opened to deepen the kiss, to answer Chloe's hunger with her own. It was a complete and total surrender. The kiss broke, and they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Chloe's blue eyes were dark with desire, her usual composure stripped away, leaving behind something raw and beautifully real. Without a word, she took Amelia's hand and led her away from the window towards the large, charcoal-colored sofa. They sank onto the soft cushions, a tangle of limbs in desperate need. Chloe's hands found the zipper at the back of Amelia's severe gray dress, her armor. The rasp of the zipper was the only sound in the room, a stark, definitive sound of undoing. The dress, which had felt like a shield of authority all day, now felt like a prison. Chloe slid it off Amelia's shoulders with a reverence that made her skin burn. The expensive wool pooled at her waist, and then Chloe eased it down over her hips, letting it fall to the floor in a discarded heap. Amelia was left in nothing but her simple slip, feeling exposed and vulnerable under Chloe's intense gaze. "Amelia," Chloe whispered, her voice thick with awe. "You are so incredibly beautiful. Does he even see you?" The question, which would have felt like an attack from anyone else, now felt like a balm on a wound she had carried for years. Amelia's hands, trembling slightly, reached for the thin silk straps of Chloe's camisole. She needed to feel her skin, to erase the last barrier between them. She slid the straps down Chloe's arms, her fingers brushing against the warmth of her shoulders. The silk was cool and fluid, and it slid away to reveal the soft, pale skin beneath. What followed was a feverish exploration, a frantic rediscovery of bodies and of self. The cool, smooth leather of the sofa was a shocking contrast to the heat of their skin. Chloe's hands were everywhere, learning the shape of Amelia's waist, the curve of her hips, the sensitive skin of her inner thighs. Her touch was not hesitant. It was confident and knowing, awakening parts of Amelia that had been dormant for a decade. And Amelia, who had long forgotten what it felt to feel true, uninhibited desire, found herself responding with an equal, desperate passion. Her hands explored the lean, strong muscles in Chloe's back, her fingers tracing the delicate line of her spine. She was no longer just a wife, a mother, a curator of a perfect home. She was a woman, alive with a fire she thought had been extinguished long ago. The air was filled with the soft, broken sounds of their pleasure. The weak protests of "we can't" and "this is wrong" had long since been replaced by breathy, urgent whispers. "Chloe, oh God," Amelia gasped, her head thrown back against the cushions as Chloe's lips trailed a line of fire down her neck. "Please, don't stop." And later, it was Chloe's turn to lose her perfect control, her own voice breaking as Amelia grew bolder, her own touch learning how to give as well as receive. Amelia, yes, right there, yes. Outside, the city glittered, a million tiny lights forming a breathtaking, indifferent audience to their transgression. But inside the apartment, their world had shrunk to the space of this sofa, to the feeling of skin against skin, to the frantic rhythm of their breathing. It was a frantic, almost violent release of everything they had held back: the loneliness, the frustration, the disappointment. For Amelia, it was more than just physical pleasure. It was a reclamation. She was taking something back that had been stolen from her, not by Chloe, but by years of quiet neglect and silent compromises. In the arms of her husband's secretary, the woman who was supposed to be her enemy, Amelia felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly seen. And as the waves of pleasure finally crashed over her, leaving her boneless and gasping in Chloe's embrace, the last coherent thought that drifted through her mind was not one of guilt or of regret, but of a devastating, terrifying, and absolute sense of release. She had finally fallen. Amelia woke slowly, surfacing from a deep, dreamless sleep into a world that was both utterly strange and profoundly right. The light was the first thing she noticed. It wasn't the soft, filtered light of her own bedroom, muted by heavy silk curtains. This was a sharp, clean city light, pouring in through a vast expanse of glass, painting the room in shades of pale gold and gray. The scent was the next thing, not the familiar lavender and linen of her home, but a complex, warm fragrance of sandalwood, coffee, and the unmistakable, intimate scent of another person's skin. She was lying on her side, tangled in sheets so soft they felt like water, and there was a steady, gentle weight across her waist. She turned her head slowly, her heart giving a single, hard thud against her ribs. It was Chloe's arm, draped possessively over her. Chloe was still asleep, her face relaxed and unguarded in the morning light, her blonde hair a messy halo on the white pillow. The memories of the night before rushed back in a dizzying, chaotic flood. The desperate kiss by the window, the rasp of the zipper on her dress, the feeling of Chloe's skin against hers on the cool leather sofa. At some point, they had moved from the living room to this bed, a detail Amelia couldn't quite recall, a testament to the feverish, intoxicating blur of their passion. A hot flush of shame washed over her, so intense it was nauseating. Guilt. It was a cold, familiar companion, but this was a new and terrifying species of it. She was naked in another woman's bed. She was a wife, a respectable woman from a good family. She had shattered her own life, her own identity, in the space of a few reckless hours. She imagined Richard, waking up alone in their cold, king-sized bed, completely oblivious. The thought should have been agonizing, but as she lay there, watching the gentle rise and fall of Chloe's shoulders as she breathed, a second, more powerful emotion rose up to challenge the guilt. It was a dizzying, potent wave of exhilaration. She felt a lightness in her limbs, a clarity in her mind that she hadn't experienced in years. The night before had been a transgression, yes, but it had also been a resurrection. She had felt desired, seen, alive. The memory of Chloe's hands on her, of her name being whispered like a prayer, was a potent antidote to the poison of her guilt. She was two people at once, the horrified wife and the exultant, liberated woman. As if sensing her turmoil, Chloe stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment her blue eyes were unfocused, soft with sleep. Then they sharpened, finding Amelia's gaze, and the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. A new tension entered the space, the awkward, hyper-aware intimacy of the morning after. Chloe didn't smile, not at first. She simply looked at Amelia, her expression a complex mixture of curiosity and something that looked like fear. "Good morning," Chloe said, her voice husky with sleep. The simple, mundane greeting felt monumental, a confirmation that this was real, that last night had happened. "Morning," Amelia whispered back, her voice barely audible. She felt a sudden, desperate need to cover herself, pulling the sheet up to her chin. The gesture was shy, almost girlish, and it felt absurd after the raw intimacy they had shared, Chloe noticed, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. She slipped out of bed, her movements fluid and completely unself-conscious. Her body was lean and beautiful in the morning light, and Amelia couldn't help but stare, a fresh wave of heat rising in her cheeks. Chloe disappeared into a closet and returned with a black silk robe, holding it out to Amelia. "Here," she said gently. "You might be more comfortable." Amelia took it, the silk cool and heavy in her hands. As she slipped it on, she felt as though she were putting on a new skin, stepping into a role she didn't know how to play. While Chloe started a coffee machine in the sleek, open-plan kitchen, Amelia walked to the window. The city was fully awake now, a teeming, roaring organism of traffic and ambition. From this height, it all looked so orderly, so distant. She felt utterly disconnected from it, as if she and Chloe were the only two people in the world, safe in their glass tower. Chloe came to stand beside her, handing her a mug of black coffee. Their fingers didn't touch this time. They drank in silence, watching the city below, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. What are we now? What happens next? Was this a mistake? But neither of them dared to ask. The silence itself was an answer. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers, but the comfortable, weighted silence of people who have already shared a profound secret. It was Chloe who finally spoke, her voice quiet. "I don't regret it," she said, not looking at Amelia, but staring out at the skyline. "I know I should, but I don't." Amelia took a shaky sip of coffee. "Neither do I," she confessed. And the truth of the words settled deep in her bones. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a pact, a silent agreement that this was not an ending. Leaving the apartment was like being expelled from a dream. Chloe kissed her at the door, a soft, lingering kiss that was a world away from the desperate passion of the night before. It was a kiss of quiet intimacy, and it left Amelia feeling breathless and unmoored. The taxi ride back to Connecticut was a surreal journey between two universes. The vibrant, sensual, emotionally charged reality of Chloe's apartment gave way to the muted greens and grays of the suburbs. When she finally walked into her own house, the silence was deafening. The air was cool and still. The sunlight streaming through the perfectly clean windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, the only sign of life. Richard's note was still on the counter. The expensive furniture stood in its designated place, silent and accusing. This house, her masterpiece of domestic perfection, now felt like a mausoleum. On her dresser, the gift box from Chloe was waiting. She opened it and looked at the black lace lingerie. It was no longer a symbol of betrayal or a challenge. It was a souvenir from another life, a tangible piece of her beautiful, terrible secret. The next 2 days were an agony of suspense. Amelia drifted through her routines, her mind constantly replaying every moment with Chloe. She was jumpy, irritable, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Richard noticed her mood, attributing it to a late anniversary celebration that hadn't quite lived up to expectations. "I'm sorry I had to work so late on Friday," he'd said, his apology as perfunctory as his affection. "We'll do something special next weekend, I promise." Amelia had just nodded, the lie catching in her throat. Then, on the third day, her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Her heart leaped. It read, "Thinking of you. C." That was all. But it was everything. It was a jolt of pure adrenaline, a secret spark in the gray monotony of her day. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile in days. It was a secret she held close, a private warmth in the coldness of her life. The texts became their secret language. They started simply, then grew more intimate. They talked about their days, about books they were reading, about the frustrations of their lives. Amelia found herself telling Chloe things she had never told anyone about her abandoned art career, about her fears of becoming invisible, about the quiet desperation of her perfect life. And Chloe, in turn, shared pieces of herself, her struggles, her dreams. A week later, they met for lunch. It was at a small, discreet French bistro, miles away from either of their usual territories. Seeing Chloe across the table, dressed in professional attire, felt both thrilling and terrifying. They were two respectable women having a business lunch, but the air between them crackled with the memory of what they had shared. Their knees brushed under the table, and the jolt was as powerful as a kiss. It was here, in the midst of this clandestine meeting, that Amelia realized the true nature of what was happening. She had stumbled into an affair, yes, but it was becoming so much more than that. It wasn't just about the sex, as incredible as it had been. It was about this: the conversation, the shared glances, the feeling of being utterly and completely understood. Chloe's attention was a heady, addictive drug. In her presence, Amelia was not just Richard Thompson's wife. She was Amelia. Witty, intelligent, desirable, and alive. The guilt was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface of her newfound joy. But it was a price she was, for now, more than willing to pay. She was living a double life, and for the first time in a decade, she felt completely vibrantly whole. Richard's business trips were a fixture of their marriage, as predictable as the changing seasons. They always followed the same ritual. He would pack his suitcase with a distracted air, his mind already in another time zone, while Amelia would lay out his shirts and ensure his travel documents were in order. He would give her a quick, dry kiss at the door, his lips barely brushing hers, and offer a perfunctory, "Be good," as if she were a child he was leaving for the weekend. For 10 years, the silence that descended upon the house after his car disappeared down the long, tree-lined driveway had felt vast and empty, a heavy blanket of loneliness. But this time, as the sound of his engine faded, the silence felt different. It was not an emptiness. It was an opportunity. It was a blank canvas, and for the first time, Amelia felt the thrilling, terrifying impulse to paint something of her own upon it. She stood in the grand two-story foyer for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The house was a monument to Richard's success and her own impeccable taste, but it was his territory. Every room, every piece of furniture, was saturated with the unspoken rules and quiet disappointments of their life together. A slow, rebellious idea began to form in her mind, a notion so audacious, so profoundly transgressive, that it made her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't text. A text was too casual, too easily misconstrued or ignored. This required a voice. She walked into Richard's study, a room of dark wood, leather, and the faint smell of his cigars, and picked up the heavy landline phone from his desk. It felt like a small act of sacrilege. She dialed Chloe's number, her fingers trembling slightly. Chloe answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. Chloe Sterling. "It's Amelia," she said, her own voice sounding strange and distant. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Amelia could almost hear Chloe's mind recalibrating, shifting from the professional to the deeply personal. "Amelia," she finally said, her tone softening into the intimate register that was reserved only for her. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Amelia replied, a smile touching her lips. "Richard left this morning. He's in Chicago until next Friday." She let the statement hang in the air, a deliberate and unmistakable invitation. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. "I was wondering," Amelia continued, her voice gaining confidence, "if you would like to come over for dinner." On Friday night, Chloe's intake of breath was sharp and audible. "To your house?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Yes," Amelia said, feeling a surge of power. "To my house." "I'd love that," Chloe said, her voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur. "I'd love that very much." The days leading up to Friday were a blur of subversive preparation. Amelia moved through her home, not as its caretaker, but as its curator, preparing the stage for an illicit performance. She went to the gourmet market and bought things Richard detested, pungent cheeses, salty oysters, a bottle of expensive, buttery Chardonnay that she adored. She went to the florist and bought armfuls of white lilies, filling the house with their heady, funereal scent. On Friday afternoon, she went upstairs to the master bedroom, the epicenter of her transgression. She stripped the bed of the sensible, beige duvet cover Richard preferred and replaced it with her finest linens, a set of Egyptian cotton sheets the color of midnight, so silky they felt like a sin against the skin. She remade the bed with a meticulous, reverent care, plumping the pillows, smoothing every last wrinkle. This was not just changing the sheets, it was a ritual of reclamation. This space, which for so long had been a place of duty and quiet resignation, was being reconsecrated, transformed into a temple for her own pleasure. When Chloe's headlights cut across the manicured lawn that evening, Amelia was waiting. She watched from the living room window as Chloe stepped out of her sleek city car, looking slightly hesitant, almost out of place in the quiet, suburban landscape. When Amelia opened the front door, the power dynamic between them had been completely inverted. Chloe was no longer the confident, controlled woman in her own territory. Here, she was the visitor, the outsider, her eyes wide as she took in the grandeur of the home. "It's beautiful, Amelia," she said, her voice soft with genuine admiration. "It's even more perfect than I imagined." "It's just a house," Amelia replied, but the words felt like a lie. Tonight, it was much more than that. They ate dinner in the formal dining room, the long, polished table set for only two. They talked and laughed, the wine loosening their inhibitions, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on their faces. It felt strangely domestic, almost normal, yet beneath the surface, the air hummed with an almost unbearable tension. After dinner, Amelia took Chloe's hand. "Let me show you the rest," she said. The tour was a slow, deliberate seduction. She led Chloe through the silent rooms, each one a chapter of her life with Richard. The living room with its cold, modern art. The library filled with books he'd never read. His study, where she had made the phone call, now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. With every step, they were erasing his presence, overwriting the history of the house with their own. Finally, they stood at the top of the stairs, before the closed doors of the master bedroom. This was the final threshold. Taking a deep breath, Amelia pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a dozen candles. The scent of lilies was thick in the air. The dark sheets on the king-size bed looked like a pool of shadows. An invitation. Chloe let out a soft, shaky breath. "Amelia," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She walked into the room and slowly turned in a circle, taking it all in. Her eyes fell on the silver-framed wedding photograph on Richard's bedside table. She picked it up, her expression unreadable. Then, she gently laid it face down. It was a simple gesture, but it was an act of profound allegiance. She turned to Amelia, her eyes dark and serious. "He doesn't deserve you," she said, her voice a low growl. "He doesn't deserve any of this." She crossed the room and stood before Amelia, her hands coming up to cup her face. The kiss that followed was nothing like their first frantic, desperate encounter. It was slow, deep, and full of a breathtaking tenderness. It was a kiss of worship. Chloe's hands roamed over her body, not with the urgency of lust, but with the patient curiosity of an explorer discovering a new world. She undressed Amelia with an agonizing slowness, her lips and hands memorizing every inch of skin she revealed. She laid Amelia down on the bed, on the cool, dark sheets that she herself had chosen. She knelt over her, her blonde hair falling around her face like a silken veil, her eyes drinking in the sight of Amelia's body in the candlelight. "You are so beautiful," Chloe whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she traced the curve of Amelia's hip. "So perfect. Does he even see you? Does he ever tell you how exquisite you are?" The words were a balm, healing wounds Amelia hadn't even known she was carrying. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. This was what she had been starving for. Not just the pleasure, but the adoration, the feeling of being truly seen. The lovemaking that followed was a slow, languid dance. It was less about a frantic release and more about a deep, sensual exploration. In her own bed, the very stage of her marital duties, Amelia discovered a capacity for pleasure she never knew she possessed. Chloe's whispers were a constant litany of praise, her touch both gentle and demanding, guiding Amelia to new heights of sensation, and Amelia, in turn, felt a new confidence, a new power. This was her space, her body, her pleasure. She was not a passive recipient, she was an active participant, claiming her own desire with a fierce, joyful abandon. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled in the dark sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. They didn't sleep. They talked for hours, their voices low whispers in the cavernous room, sharing secrets and dreams in the kind of intimate, unguarded conversation Amelia had never once shared with the man who owned the other half of this bed. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Amelia finally fell asleep, curled in Chloe's arms, in her own bed. The transgression was complete, and it felt terrifyingly, wonderfully, like coming home. The week with Chloe had been a dream, a stolen idol in a sun-drenched, sensual world of their own making. Richard's return was a harsh and sudden awakening. The night before he was due home, Amelia began the methodical process of erasure, a frantic, guilt-ridden cleansing of her sacred crime scene. She stripped the bed of the midnight blue sheets, the silken fabric still holding the faint, ghost-like scent of Chloe's skin and perfume. She washed them not once but twice, adding an extra measure of unscented detergent as if she could scrub away the memory of their passion. She opened all the windows, letting a cool autumn breeze sweep through the house, chasing away the last vestiges of white lilies and candle wax. She walked through every room, plumping cushions, straightening rugs, meticulously restoring the house to its state of perfect, untouched order. The final act was the most painful. She picked up the silver-framed wedding photograph from where Chloe had laid it face down on the nightstand and restored it to its upright position. Richard's smiling, oblivious face stared back at her, and for the first time, Amelia felt a sharp, stabbing pang of something that felt less like guilt and more like pity. He was a stranger living in her house. When his car finally pulled into the driveway the next afternoon, Amelia had transformed herself. The sensual, liberated woman who had shared her bed with a lover was gone, replaced by the familiar, placid mask of the perfect wife. She greeted him at the door with a warm, practiced smile and a kiss that felt like a betrayal to two different people. "Welcome home, darling," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of wifely affection. "How was Chicago?" He grunted a non-committal reply, his mind already on the pile of mail on the hall table. "Fine, the usual. Anything interesting happen here?" he asked, the question a casual afterthought. "No, darling," she lied, the words sliding off her tongue with a terrifying ease, quiet as a tomb. He noticed nothing, of course. He didn't notice the faint shadows under her eyes from a week of sleepless, passion-filled nights. He didn't notice the new, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. He saw what he always saw, his beautiful wife, his perfect home, the orderly, predictable backdrop to his important life. His blindness, once the source of her deepest pain, was now her greatest asset. It was the cloak of invisibility that allowed her new, secret life to flourish. And flourish it did. The affair, which had been born in a crucible of anger and curiosity, now settled into a complex, clandestine rhythm. Amelia's life became a masterclass in deception, a meticulously choreographed performance. Her calendar, once a placid landscape of charity luncheons and dentist appointments, became a coded map of her secret world. Book club was an afternoon spent in Chloe's sun-drenched apartment. A gallery opening was a shared dinner at a discreet restaurant where no one would know them. A long shopping trip was hours spent tangled in the sheets of a boutique hotel they'd discovered halfway between the city and the suburbs. Her phone, once a simple tool of communication, became a dangerous and essential extension of her being. It was a portal to her real life, a constant source of both thrilling connection and heart-stopping terror. It was never left on a table, always kept screened down. Messages from Chloe were read in the privacy of a bathroom or a walk-in closet, then immediately deleted. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Amelia found herself living in a state of heightened alert, her nerves stretched taut, her senses constantly scanning for threats. She learned to listen for the sound of Richard's car in the driveway, to recognize the cadence of his footsteps on the stairs. She became an expert in the art of the plausible lie, constructing alibis with the same meticulous care she once used to plan dinner parties. The first close call came on a Tuesday, about a month after Richard's return. Amelia had spent the afternoon with Chloe, a lazy, sensual few hours that had left her feeling languid and glowing. She'd rushed home, arriving only minutes before Richard, and in her haste, she had forgotten one crucial detail. As he walked in, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her into a hug and burying his face in her neck. He murmured against her skin. "You smell nice. Is that a new perfume?" Amelia's blood ran cold. It was Chloe's scent. The sandalwood and white tea was faint, but it was clinging to her hair, her skin. For a full 3 seconds, her mind went completely blank with panic. 1,000 disastrous scenarios played out in her head. Then, instinct took over. She turned in his arms, a bright, dismissive smile plastered on her face. "Oh, this?" she said, touching her neck lightly. "I was at the department store." One of those horribly pushy saleswomen ambushed me with a sample. I think I'll need a shower to scrub it off. Richard accepted the explanation without a second thought, his mind already moving on to his emails. But the jolt of pure, undiluted fear lingered with Amelia for the rest of the night. She lay awake long after he was asleep, her heart still hammering, the ghost of Chloe's scent now feeling like a brand of guilt upon her skin. The second incident was worse. It was a quiet Sunday evening. A fire crackled in the hearth, and they were sitting in the living room, a picture of perfect domestic tranquility. Richard was reading the Wall Street Journal, and Amelia was pretending to read a novel, her mind 1,000 miles away, reliving a kiss she'd shared with Chloe the day before. Her phone was on the small table between their armchairs. It was a fatal mistake. It buzzed and lit up, the screen glowing in the dim room. A message preview flashed across the screen for a brief, eternal moment. It was from Chloe. Amelia's eyes darted to the screen, reading the words upside down. "I can't stop thinking about you." That dress. Richard glanced over, not with suspicion, but with the casual curiosity of a person noticing a light. "Message from Chloe," he said, his voice mild. "Is she working on a Sunday? I hope you're not letting her bill me for weekend hours." Amelia felt the floor drop out from beneath her. He hadn't read the message, but he had seen the name. She had to get the phone, but her movements needed to be natural, unhurried. She forced a light laugh. "Heavens, no," she said, reaching for the phone with a hand that felt strangely disconnected from her body. She snatched it up, her thumb immediately swiping the notification away. "She was just asking about the caterer for the firm's holiday party. I told her I had a good recommendation." She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. "I'll just text her back from the kitchen." She escaped the room, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. In the cold, silent kitchen, she leaned against the counter, gasping for air. The lie had been seamless, but the risk, the sheer, stupid luck of it, left her shaken to her core. The sanctuary of her home was no longer safe. There were no safe spaces anymore. The web of lies was growing more complex, more fragile with each passing day. The thrill of the affair was still there, a potent, addictive current running just beneath the surface of her life. But now, it was inextricably woven with a constant, grinding anxiety. She was a performer on a high wire, and for the first time, she was truly, terrifyingly aware of the long, long way down. The invitation to the firm's annual awards gala felt less like a social obligation and more like a summons to her own trial. For years, these events had been a predictable part of her life as Mrs. Richard Thompson. She would wear an elegant gown, smile graciously, and make polite, meaningless conversation with her husband's colleagues and their wives. It was a role she could perform in her sleep. But this year, the thought of it filled her with a cold, liquid dread. Chloe would be there. Of course, she would be there. She was an indispensable part of the firm, the engine that kept Richard's world running smoothly. The idea of seeing her in the same room as Richard, of her two separate, warring worlds colliding under the glittering chandeliers of a hotel ballroom, was terrifying. There would be nowhere to hide. The evening of the gala, Amelia stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, a stranger in her own skin. She had chosen her dress with the meticulous care of a general selecting armor for a decisive battle. It was a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her body like a second skin, leaving her shoulders and back bare. It was a statement. It was a weapon. But as she stared at her reflection, she couldn't decide who the weapon was aimed at. Richard, oblivious as ever, came up behind her, adjusting his black tie. "You look stunning, Amelia," he said, his eyes on his own reflection. Absolutely stunning. The compliment was automatic, a line he had delivered a dozen times before, and it slid off her without leaving a trace. He saw the dress, the diamonds at her ears, the carefully applied makeup. He saw the perfect wife, an asset to be displayed. He did not see the frantic, terrified woman inside. The ballroom was a sea of black tie professionals, a glittering, self-congratulatory world of success. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of clinking champagne glasses. Amelia slipped into her role with practiced ease, her smile a fixed, brilliant thing. But behind the facade, her senses were on high alert, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching, dreading, and then she saw her. Chloe was standing near the bar, talking to one of the firm's senior partners. She was not the soft, vulnerable lover from the apartment, nor the cool, efficient professional from the office. Tonight, she was a vision of power and grace. She wore a simple, backless black gown that was the epitome of sophisticated elegance. Her hair was swept up, showcasing the long, graceful line of her neck. She held her champagne flute with an easy confidence, laughing at something the partner said, completely at ease in this world of influence and ambition. A feeling so sharp and painful that it made Amelia catch her breath pierce through her. It was jealousy, but it was a strange, multifaceted, and unfamiliar strain of the emotion. Later, as they were seated at their table near the front of the stage, Richard spotted Chloe across the room. "Ah, there she is," he said, a note of genuine warmth in his voice. "I need to ask her about the final numbers for the Peterson project." He beckoned her over, and Amelia's carefully constructed composure threatened to shatter. Chloe approached their table, her movements fluid and self-assured. The performance began. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice a perfect blend of warmth and professional deference. "Mrs. Thompson, you look absolutely breathtaking tonight." "Thank you, Chloe," Amelia managed to say, her own voice sounding thin and brittle. "That's a lovely dress." Richard, completely unaware of the raging undercurrents, launched into a detailed discussion about zoning variances and building materials. And Amelia was forced to sit there, a smiling, silent observer, as the two most important people in her life conversed in a language she could not understand. She watched the easy rapport between them, the shared glances and professional shorthand that spoke of countless hours spent together, of a partnership that existed entirely outside of her, and the jealousy twisted inside her, sharp and complex. She was not, she realized with a dizzying shock, jealous of Chloe for having her husband's attention. The thought was absurd. No, she was jealous of Richard. She was profoundly, painfully jealous of him for his effortless public claim on this brilliant, beautiful woman. He could summon her with a wave of his hand. He could benefit from her mind, her talent, her energy, every single day. He could stand beside her, bathed in public approval, while Amelia's own connection to Chloe, a connection that felt 1,000 times more real and profound, had to be hidden away in the shadows, to a shameful secret. She was also jealous of Chloe herself. She watched the way the senior partners, the clients, the other architects, all looked at Chloe with an undeniable respect. They saw her as a peer, a force to be reckoned with. Chloe had a name, an identity, a purpose in this world that was entirely her own. She was not an accessory on someone else's arm. She was the architect of her own life. In that moment, Amelia felt the full weight of what she had given up: her art, her ambition, her own name, and the life she had chosen in its place felt like a beautiful, exquisitely decorated cage. The speeches droned on, awards were handed out, but Amelia saw and heard none of it. Her entire universe had contracted to the unbearable drama at her own table. Later, she excused herself, needing to escape, to breathe air that wasn't thick with lies. As she was returning from the powder room, she saw Chloe standing alone for a moment by a service corridor, looking at her phone. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway. For a fraction of a second, the masks fell away. In Chloe's eyes, Amelia saw a flicker of the same longing and frustration she felt herself. Chloe gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture that said everything. "This is impossible. This is agony." Amelia walked towards her, her heart pounding. When she was close, she didn't stop, but she slowed her pace, letting her hand brush against Chloe's as she passed. The contact was electric, a jolt of truth in a night of suffocating falsehoods. "I hate this," Amelia whispered, her voice so low it was barely a breath, not even looking at her as she continued walking. She didn't have to. She felt Chloe's answering shiver. The drive home was silent. Richard was buoyant, pleased with an award the firm had won. He talked about Chloe's contributions, praising her strategic mind, her tireless work ethic. "She's incredible," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without her." Each word of praise was a fresh twist of the knife. He was praising Amelia's lover, completely unaware that he was describing the woman who had systematically dismantled his wife's life and rebuilt it into something he would never recognize. Back home, Amelia stood in front of her mirror once again, taking off the diamonds, the emerald gown. She looked at her own reflection, but the face that stared back was fractured. She was a wife. She was a lover. She was a liar. The affair had started as an escape, a way to feel alive. But the jealousy she'd felt tonight, that possessive, desperate, and confusing emotion, had clarified everything. It was no longer just about desire or rebellion. She was in love with Chloe. And that realization, in the cold, silent aftermath of the glittering gala, was not a liberation. It was a life sentence. The days that followed the gala were a special kind of hell. The realization that she was in love with Chloe had not brought Amelia any sense of romantic clarity. It had only sharpened the edges of her daily torment. Every morning, she woke up with a hollow ache in her chest, the knowledge that Chloe was getting dressed, commuting into the city, and walking into an office to spend the next 8 hours in the orbit of her husband. The jealousy she had felt in the ballroom didn't fade. It metastasized, growing into a possessive, paranoid creature that lived permanently in the pit of her stomach. She imagined their conversations, the shared jokes about clients, the easy professional intimacy she had witnessed. It was a slow, agonizing poison. The affair, which had once been her vibrant, secret escape, now felt like a cage of a different design. The stolen afternoons felt insufficient, the secret lunches a pale imitation of the life she desperately wanted. The constant threat of exposure, which had once been a source of thrilling adrenaline, now just felt like a grinding, relentless anxiety. She was coming apart at the seams. The breaking point came on a Thursday, a week after the gala. She was driving home from a meaningless charity committee meeting, the hypocrisy of her life a bitter taste in her mouth. She was discussing fundraising for underprivileged children while her own life was a monument to selfish, reckless desire. Suddenly, the image of Chloe and Richard standing together, smiling under the ballroom lights, flashed in her mind with such brutal clarity that she had to pull the car over to the side of the road. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't breathe. The carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbled into dust. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with a cold sweat, and dialed Chloe's number. It was a reckless, impulsive act, and she didn't care. Chloe answered on the first ring, her voice a low, professional murmur. "Chloe Sterling, I have to see you," Amelia said, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. Now, there was a pause, and Amelia could hear the faint, muffled sounds of an office in the background. "Amelia, are you okay? Where are you?" "I don't know. On the side of the road somewhere. I don't care, I need you. I can't do this anymore." The words tumbled out, a confession of her complete unraveling. She didn't mean she wanted to end it. She meant she could no longer survive in the fractured reality they had created. "Okay," Chloe said, her voice instantly shedding its professional calm, becoming the voice that Amelia craved, the voice of her lover. "Okay, listen to me. There's a hotel, the Blackwood, on 54th Street. Go there. Book a room under your maiden name. I'll leave work. I'll be there in an hour." The hotel room was the physical embodiment of their affair, expensive, beautiful, and utterly soulless. It was a space designed for transient secrets, with its king-sized bed, its generic abstract art, and its large panoramic window that looked out onto an indifferent city. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, and waited. When Chloe finally knocked on the door, Amelia practically flung it open. They stood for a moment, just staring at each other. Chloe was still in her work attire, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. All the pain, jealousy, and frustration of the past week culminated in that single, desperate moment. "I can't stand it, Chloe," Amelia choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. "I can't stand thinking of you there with him, talking to him, being a part of his world while I have to hide. I hate it. I hate him for having you. What do you want me to do?" Chloe shot back, her own voice raw with a pain that mirrored Amelia's. "Quit my job? Disappear? This is my life, Amelia. Do you think this is easy for me?" The argument was the only foreplay they needed. The pain, the anger, the sheer, screaming impossibility of their situation was a more potent aphrodisiac than any gentle seduction. Amelia closed the space between them, her hands grabbing the lapels of Chloe's blazer, and crushed her mouth to hers. The kiss was not tender. It was a violent, bruising collision, a desperate attempt to communicate everything they couldn't say with words. It was a kiss of rage and of hopeless, desperate love. What followed was not lovemaking. It was a storm. It was a frantic, almost violent exorcism of their shared despair. Clothes were not removed. They were torn away. The sharp sound of a button popping from Chloe's silk blouse echoed in the silent room. Amelia's hands were rough, possessive, her nails leaving faint red marks on Chloe's shoulders. She was not exploring Chloe's body. She was claiming it, trying to mark it as her own in a way the world would never allow. Chloe met her ferocity with an equal, desperate hunger. Her hands tangled in Amelia's hair, pulling her head back, her teeth grazing the skin of Amelia's neck. This was not the slow, sensual dance of their night in Amelia's bed. This was a frantic, primal act, driven by the terrifying knowledge that this was all they could ever have. The sounds that filled the sterile hotel room were raw and unrestrained, the sounds of two people at the absolute edge of their control. The whispers were not of praise, but of a desperate primal need. Chloe. God. Please, Amelia gasped, her body arching against her lover's. Don't stop. Please, don't ever stop. It was a plea not just for physical release, but for an escape from the unbearable reality of their lives. She was trying to lose herself so completely in the physical sensation that the pain in her heart would finally be silenced. Their bodies moved with a frantic, desperate rhythm, a search for something more than just an orgasm. It was a search for oblivion. Amelia's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. With every thrust, with every gasp of Chloe's name, she was trying to physically absorb her, to possess her so completely that Richard and her marriage and the entire lying world outside this room would simply cease to exist. It was a battle against reality, and their bodies were the weapons. And when the climax finally came, it was not the gentle, cresting wave of their previous encounters. It was a violent, shattering explosion, a cataclysm that ripped a raw, ragged scream from both of their throats. It was a moment of such intense, annihilating pleasure that it bordered on pain. It was the absolute peak, the highest they could ever go. And then, it was over. The crash back to reality was brutal and instantaneous. The adrenaline vanished, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. The silence that filled the room was heavier, more desolate than any they had ever shared. They lay on the rumpled sheets of the anonymous bed, not touching, their bodies slick with sweat. The space between them, which moments before had been filled with a desperate, all-consuming passion, now felt like an impassable chasm. Amelia turned her head on the pillow and looked at Chloe. Her lover's face was streaked with tears, her eyes closed, her expression one of utter, heartbreaking despair. The raw passion had solved nothing. It had only served to illuminate the stark, ugly truth of their situation. This frantic, desperate act was not a sustainable escape. It was the last convulsive moments of a dying dream. In the cold, gray light of the hotel room, surrounded by the wreckage of their passion, Amelia knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they had just reached the beginning of the end. The silence that followed their frantic climax was more profound and desolate than any Amelia had ever known. It was not the peaceful, sated silence that follows gentle lovemaking. It was a vacuum, a hollowed-out space where the storm of their passion had just raged, leaving behind nothing but wreckage. They lay on the bed, separated by a chasm of rumpled sheets, their bodies still damp, their breathing still ragged. The sterile, impersonal hotel room, which moments before had been their secret battlefield, now felt like a tomb. The gray afternoon light filtering through the window seemed to leach the color from the world, casting everything in a melancholic, funereal pallor. Amelia stared at the ceiling, her mind a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer, annihilating force of their encounter. But slowly, painfully, thoughts began to trickle back in, and with them came an awareness so sharp and lucid it was like a physical blow. The passion had not been an escape. It had been a final, desperate convulsion, a death throw. It had solved nothing. It had only illuminated the stark, hopeless truth of their situation. She turned her head on the pillow to look at Chloe. Her lover lay on her back, one arm thrown over her eyes as if to block out the light or the world. Her perfect, composed face, which had been a mask of raw, ecstatic pleasure just minutes before, was now a portrait of utter despair. A single, silent tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her hairline. The sight of that tear broke something deep inside Amelia. The fragile dam that held back her own confusion and heartbreak finally gave way. "Chloe?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Chloe didn't move, didn't answer. "What are we doing?" Amelia asked, the question floating in the dead air between them. It was a question she had been screaming in the silence of her own mind for weeks, and now, hearing it spoken aloud, it sounded small and pathetic. Chloe finally lowered her arm, her blue eyes red-rimmed and filled with an exhaustion that seemed bone-deep. She looked at Amelia, and for the first time, Amelia saw no trace of the lover, the confidant, or the formidable professional. She just saw a woman who was profoundly, hopelessly sad. "We're destroying ourselves," Chloe answered, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That's what we're doing." "No," Amelia said, sitting up, pulling a sheet around her bare shoulders. The gesture was one of defense, of denial. "No, this is real. What we have, I feel it. Don't you?" "Of course it's real," Chloe said, her voice rising with a raw, frayed edge. "The pain is real. The lies are real. The fact that I have to watch you go home to your husband is real, Amelia. Don't you dare question if this is real. I just want to be with you," Amelia pleaded, the words sounding childish and naive even to her own ears. It was the whisper of a fantasy, a daydream of a life that could never exist. "And how do you imagine that?" Chloe asked, sitting up as well, her gaze mercilessly direct. "Tell me the plan. Do you leave your husband, your home, the life you've spent your entire adulthood building? Do you walk away from the social standing, the friends, the family, the security? For what? For me? For secret meetings in sad, anonymous hotel rooms?" Every question was a dagger, puncturing the beautiful, impossible bubble Amelia had built around them. "This isn't a life, Amelia," Chloe continued, her voice breaking. "This is a holding pattern, a beautiful, passionate, agonizing waiting room, and I don't know what we're waiting for." The argument was not a shouting match. It was a quiet, brutal dissection, a post-mortem of their affair while it was still breathing its last. They were two surgeons, cutting away at their own creation, exposing the fatal flaws that had been there from the very beginning. "Was this ever about me?" Chloe asked, her voice dropping to a whisper of genuine pain. "Or was I just a weapon for you? A way to get back at a husband who didn't see you? Was I just the most convenient, most hurtful way for you to rebel?" The accusation struck Amelia with the force of a physical blow because it contained a sliver of truth. The affair had started that way, as a reaction, an act of defiance. But it had become so much more. "No," Amelia insisted, shaking her head. "Number. It became about you. Only you. Is that what you think of me? That I'm that cruel?" She threw the question back, her own insecurities rushing to the surface. "And what about you? Was I just a project? A challenge? The boss's perfect, untouchable wife? Was I just a conquest for you?" They were hurting each other now, using their deepest fears as weapons, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to make sense of the wreckage. Finally, the most dangerous question of all fell from Amelia's lips. "Don't you love me?" she asked, her voice small, her entire being braced for the answer. Chloe let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind Amelia's ear, her touch gentle, achingly familiar. "Of course I love you," she said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "That's the entire problem. If this were just about sex, just about revenge, it would be easy. We could just stop. But I love you, and that's why this is killing me. Because love isn't enough, Amelia. It's not enough to build a bridge between your world and mine. It's not enough to erase your husband or my career or the lies we have to tell every single day. Love is the reason we have to stop." And there it was, the final, undeniable truth. The fantasy evaporated, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality. There was no path forward. There was no secret third option where they could be together and happy. There was only the life Amelia had, and the life Chloe had, and the unbridgeable chasm between them. The argument was over. There was nothing left to say. The unraveling was complete. Slowly, deliberately, they began the sad mechanical process of getting dressed. It was the inverse of their frantic, passionate undressing just an hour before. Each movement was heavy with resignation. Amelia pulled on her slip, her dress, the familiar armor of her respectable life. Chloe buttoned her blouse, put on her blazer, reassuming the role of the capable professional. They moved around the small hotel room like ghosts, careful not to touch, their intimacy replaced by a formal, heartbreaking distance. When they were both fully dressed, standing on opposite sides of the ruined bed, the silence was absolute. "I should go," Chloe said, her voice hollow. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the knob. She didn't turn around. "Take care of yourself, Amelia." Amelia could only nod, a knot of grief so tight in her throat that she couldn't speak. Then, Chloe was gone. The soft click of the hotel room door was the loudest sound Amelia had ever heard. It was the sound of a final, irrevocable ending. She stood alone in the center of the room for a long time, a solitary, silent statue in a tomb of her own making. The climax of her passion had led only to this, a devastating, absolute emptiness. There was no single dramatic end. Their affair did not conclude with a slamming door or a tearful final goodbye. It simply stopped. In the days and weeks that followed their meeting in the hotel room, a profound and heavy silence fell between them. Amelia's phone, once a source of constant, thrilling connection, became a dormant, useless object in her hand. Each time it buzzed with an email or a message from a friend, her heart would leap with a foolish, desperate hope, only to crash back to earth. She would check it compulsively, her thumb hovering over Chloe's name in her contacts, a war raging within her between her pride and her pain. But she never called. And Chloe, in what Amelia could only interpret as an act of either supreme cruelty or profound mercy, never called her. Their passion, which had burned so brightly it had threatened to consume them both, was not extinguished in a sudden gust of wind. It was starved of oxygen, left to slowly, quietly suffocate in the silence. The official news, the final, clinical severance, came from the one person in the world who did not understand its significance. It came from Richard. He announced it one evening over dinner, his voice casual, tinged only with professional annoyance. "Strange thing today," he said, cutting into his steak. Chloe resigned. Gave her 2 weeks' notice, but the firm has a policy about senior staff leaving for competitors. I told her she could just clear out her desk by the end of the day. Amelia's fork clattered onto her plate. She felt the blood drain from her face, a cold, sickening lurch in the pit of her stomach. She struggled to keep her expression neutral, to arrange her features into a mask of mild curiosity. "Oh," she said, her voice sounding impossibly calm. "That's a surprise. Where is she going?" "San Francisco," Richard said, shaking his head. "Some tech architecture firm out there made her a massive offer. Can't blame her, I suppose. It's a real shame, though. She was the best I ever had. Finding a replacement will be a nightmare." He continued to talk, lamenting the inconvenience, the difficulty of the hiring process, completely oblivious to the fact that he was narrating the final chapter of his wife's epic secret love story. Amelia just sat there, nodding, making the appropriate sympathetic noises, while inside, her world was silently collapsing. San Francisco. It was another country, another universe. It was a definitive, geographical end. Chloe was gone. In the months that followed, Amelia drifted through her life in a fog of quiet, persistent grief. The world, which had seemed so vibrant and full of color when she was with Chloe, now seemed muted, its edges blurred. She performed her duties as a wife and mother with a hollow, robotic precision. But something had irrevocably shifted inside her. The rage she had once felt toward Richard was gone, burned away in the fire of her affair. Now, when she looked at him, she felt only a deep, abiding pity. She saw a man who was utterly blind, a man who possessed a beautiful, complex world, but lacked the senses to perceive it. He was not a monster. He was just a limited, two-dimensional man, incapable of the depth of passion and pain she now knew existed. His obliviousness was no longer an insult. It was simply a condition of his being, like the color of his eyes. In a strange, quiet way, she had forgiven him, because he no longer had the power to hurt her. He was simply there, a piece of furniture in the house of her life. One rainy Saturday afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive silence of her home, Amelia found herself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic. It was a place of forgotten things, a graveyard of past lives. In a corner, under a dusty canvas sheet, were her old art supplies, her easel, her boxes of dried oil paints, her portfolios of charcoal sketches. She hadn't touched them since the first few years of her marriage. She ran her hand over a canvas, the rough texture, a jolt of memory. With a sudden, clear sense of purpose, she carried everything downstairs and set it up in the spare bedroom that got the best morning light. And she began to paint. At first, her hands were clumsy, her movements stiff. But soon, the old rhythms returned, and something new was unleashed. Her art was different now. The polite landscapes and delicate still lifes of her youth were gone. In their place came bold, abstract canvases, full of chaotic energy, of deep, bruised purples and brilliant, defiant reds. She painted with a ferocity that surprised her, pouring all of her grief, her rage, her love, and her transcendent secret joy onto the canvas. She was not just painting pictures, she was painting her survival. Late one night, nearly a year after Chloe had left, Amelia was woken by the sound of a distant storm. Richard was asleep beside her, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the dark. She slipped out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath her feet, and walked to the tall dresser in her dressing room. From the very back of her lingerie drawer, she pulled out a small, elegant box. The box. She opened it. The black lace lingerie lay nestled in the tissue paper, as perfect and dangerous as the day it had arrived. She lifted it, the delicate fabric cool and light in her hands. It was a relic. A sacred object from a life she had lived for a few brilliant, impossible months. It was no longer a symbol of her husband's betrayal or a challenge from a rival. It was the symbol of her own. It was the proof that she had once been a woman capable of a grand, all-consuming passion. It was the memory of being truly, completely seen. It was the evidence of her rebellion, her heartbreak, and her ultimate quiet transformation. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. She would never wear it, but she would never, ever throw it away. She placed it back in its box and closed the drawer, her secret safely tucked away. She walked to the window and watched the lightning flash across the distant sky, illuminating the dark, manicured lawns of her perfect, silent world. She was alone, but she was not the same woman who had lived here a year ago. A part of her would always belong to Chloe, to the memory of their impossible love. And the rest of her, the woman who stood here now, watching the storm finally and completely, belonged only to herself.